I'm delighted to be here. My name again is Deborah Elms. I head the Asian Trade Center here in Singapore. We do a number of things at the ATC, two of which might be of particular interest to this audience. The first is that we're very actively involved in trade negotiations, and in particular for the negotiations that I'm going to talk to you about today, which is the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, or RCEP. I personally attended 17 rounds of those negotiations and have been following it since 2014 until now. So, quite involved in RCEP negotiations, helping government officials understand what issues business brings to the table and why those matter to companies. Then the second thing that we do a lot of in the Asian Trade Center, and you'll see a little bit of that in today's presentation, is help companies understand how to use these trade agreements once they're negotiated. Because frankly, there's no point in spending a lot of time, effort, years of work negotiating a trade agreement if at the end of the day, companies don't understand what it is, they don't understand how to use it, and then they don't take advantage of the benefits that are on offer. So a lot of our work is helping companies figure out how to map their existing operations onto various kinds of trade agreements, and then having them think a bit more creatively about what might they do slightly differently if they have any plans for expansion or adjustment in the future to take better advantage or to harness a trade agreement even more effectively than they might already be doing. And I think that's especially important, I would say, for sectors that are challenging to operate in, and dairy especially, which is the topic of today, is always difficult. And so anytime I would argue that you can use a trade agreement to your advantage, the better, because it gives you an opportunity that especially your competitors who are less savvy than you are may not be taking advantage of. So again, what do? We help governments do a better job of negotiating trade agreements, and then we help companies use those trade agreements. So what I'm going to do today is walk you through some of the trade benefits that are available for you coming ahead for dairy specifically in RCEP. So let me now share my screen quickly, and I will take you through this slideshow. So here we go. All right, so what I want to do now is go through the RCEP negotiations in a little bit more detail and describe what the benefits are that are on offer for the dairy sector. RCEP has 15 countries here in Asia. So 15 countries, we have all 10 members of ASEAN, plus China, Japan, Korea, Australia, and New Zealand. So all of Asia coming together for the first time in one single integrated trade agreement. I think that is extremely helpful for companies and will give you a significant amount of benefits, even in, as I'll mention in just a moment, even in the dairy sector, which is unfortunately, or maybe fortunately for you, a bit more complicated than some other sectors. It's a comprehensive trade agreement. It covers trade in goods. It also covers services and investment. And I find that many companies don't always think about services and investment when what you ship is products, you ship goods. You think of yourself as a goods company. But actually, for a lot of what you do, it's increasingly the services. How do you deliver value to your customers? How do you make sure that products are effectively marketed? And then investment in different countries around the region to help facilitate the growth of your sector or your company. It also includes a little bit of work on standards. We could certainly do more in Asia, but this is a little light at the moment, to be fair, on standards like labeling laws, testing requirements, et cetera, which matter a lot for companies. There's also legal provisions. The whole agreement is legally binding. Most of the agreement, I should say, is legally binding. There are a lot of rules on intellectual property rights to protect patents and innovations, for example. Some rules on e-commerce, and the beginning of something on government procurement. So when the government starts to buy things for its own use, either for government or for, let's say, food products for hospitals or for state schools, that is not yet covered, but could be in the future. The whole agreement is about 500 pages of text, plus 14,000 pages of individual country schedules. So this is a monster agreement that takes some time to process. It's coming into force soon. We anticipate that around January 1st, the agreement will become live. We need 6 out of 10 members of ASEAN and 3 out of what we call dialogue partners, China, Japan, Korea, Australia, New Zealand. 3 of them have to ratify the agreement, and then it comes into force 60 days later. We already have 4 countries that have finished the procedures. So China, Japan, dialogue partners, Thailand, Singapore, ASEAN members have already ratified the deal. And as soon as the 9th one says yes, 60 days later, the agreement comes into force. So I think that's very useful. You have a certain amount of time then as a company, a little over 6-7 months now, in which to get organized, to be ready to take advantage of RCEP at the beginning. And I think you're going to need 6 or 7 months, to be honest, in order to really unpick the agreement and figure out where those benefits might be for you and how you might better take advantage of them. The agreement has always been labeled as a China-led RCEP. So the media reports on this for all the years that we negotiated said, China leads RCEP on and fills in the blank what. That's actually not true. This is an agreement that ASEAN led. And because ASEAN led the agreement, it's based on the way that ASEAN operates. So that's both good news and not such great news. One challenge is that it's complicated. Anytime you have 10 countries leading something, you can imagine how hard it is to get an answer or get to the end. And so that was a bit of an issue in RCEP. But now that it's done, I think we will see more emphasis placed on some of the bigger players in the agreement, especially a China or a Japan, who by economic weight and power actually do have an outsized voice or will have an outsized voice. It provides a platform for trade and economic discussions in the region. There will be an RCEP secretariat that will keep track of this agreement. I think that's especially important for companies because it means that someone should be keeping track of this agreement every day. And there should be a phone number or a website or whatever that you can call, and you can then ask them specific questions about RCEP and its implementation and so forth. I think for companies, that's actually a very big deal because it helps ensure that governments deliver on their promises, always important, but also gives you a mechanism for you to connect with those various government officials and address some of the challenges that you might be facing in using RCEP or moving product around in Asia. 18 months after it starts, it may open for new members. First in line is likely to be Hong Kong, but again, it just sort of depends on how the sort of world evolves between now and 18 months from now. So let me now turn to some of the benefits in this agreement. And I will tell you up front, it's a bit challenging. And it's particularly challenging, as I'll get to in just a second, for the dairy sector specifically. The reason for that is that we have a very diverse group of countries in RCEP. The 15 countries that are in there range from very large to very tiny, very wealthy to very poor, countries that have lots of islands, countries that have landlocked. So it's very hard to get an agreement that satisfies this diverse membership. Plus, it was built on what we call the ASEAN +1 trade deals. And some of you may be familiar with how these work. ASEAN +1 trade deals are things like ASEAN China, ASEAN Korea, ASEAN Japan, et cetera. So that's the underlying process for this RCEP. And what they had hoped to do was say, well, there's 5 of them. It's very difficult for companies to know about 5 different agreements. Wouldn't it be great if we just put them all on the table? We bundled them up, RCEP. It'd be super fast, it'd be easy, we'll be done in 3 years, it's gonna be great. It turns out not so easy. It took 8 years to get to the finish line because what I'm willing to do within ASEAN or what I'm willing to do with, let's say, Japan is not what I wanna do with China. So that's a problem. Plus, and I think this is key, there were no existing agreements in place between Japan and Korea and between Japan and China. So Northeast Asia was uncovered. New agreement coming, binds them together in ways that was not possible before. And we had India involved for all 8 years of negotiations. And India had very poor links as well with everybody. So the India-China competition was very complicated. The net result of that for a company is a complicated deal. We have, for tariff reductions in particular, 37 different schedules. Some of them have very long time horizons, and I'll point to just one simple example in just a moment. So it's hard to unravel and say, what are the benefits in this agreement for me? What am I trying to do? What might I try to do in the future? So the unraveling for tariff concessions especially is tricky. However, and I think this is important, there's only one rule of origin that covers all 15 markets in the region. So once you create a product that you think can be used in one of the countries, you can now ship it without change to all of them. And especially for the dairy sector, The rules are quite interesting and quite helpful, and I'll talk about that in just a second. So the point is there's one rule of origin. Once you meet the rule of origin, you can ship it without change into all 15 markets. And you can do so with one preferential certificate of origin. So those of you who are used to trying to deal with, ASEAN Form D or AJK or whatever, you don't need to do that anymore. You use one certificate of origin, and now you can process this into all 15 markets. So for compliance purposes for companies, that's very important because it means it should limit your compliance costs and complexity. You should have less risk of having some individual in your company who fills out the wrong paperwork or who grabs something off the wrong shelf and then tries to ship it and then ends up with Korean customs and a huge fine. So I think this is very helpful for companies. Let me get into a little bit of detail, not extensive detail, but a little bit of detail for dairy. This is a tough sector, as you well know. There's usually heavy protection for the dairy sector in general. That means often high tariffs, and some of them are eye-watering. I mean, just looking, you'll see a second here. Wow, crazy high tariffs. There's also tariff rate quotas in effect for many markets or many products, which says that up to a certain amount, you can export at a reasonable price. And then as soon as you go above that threshold of quantity, let's say 100 metric tons, just to make it simple, as soon as the 101st metric ton comes into the market, the tariff skyrockets and makes it really impossible for you to ship once you've hit the quota. And so those are in some cases still embedded in RCEP. Not every country uses tariff rate quotas, thankfully, but that most of them apply to dairy. So where we have them in existence, they're in your sector. We also have various kinds of standards and labeling problems that are an issue for dairy as well as others. And as a result of that, dairy is almost always the last sector to be concluded in an FTA negotiation. It's just tough, it's contentious. And it was really rough in RCEP because we had, among other things, New Zealand, which is the world's powerhouse dairy producer. And everyone was nervous about what happens if we open up our dairy sector. Will we be flooded with Kiwi Fonterra dairy products? And also we had India involved. And India, as you may know, is a very serious dairy producer of its own. And so that complication of having really, really competitive dairy producers plus some deep, long-standing issues around dairy meant that dairy has limited benefits in some areas and longer timelines and more complexity. So I apologize for that. You're in a challenging sector. I think there are benefits to be had, but it is challenging. It's also hard because a lot of what you produce gets put into other sensitive things. So dairy, powdered milk, for example, into processed food products, little more sensitivity often around processed foods, chocolate, one of those super complicated sectors always, baby formula, infant formula, and nutritional formulas of all kinds, super, this is, you're really happen to be in one of the most challenging sectors, frankly, for trade negotiators, certainly because of the sensitivities around it. So what does that look like then? Let me just give you a very simple example, and you will see that it varies. So China right now has a 10% base tariff in place on powdered dry milk. That drops to 0, hallelujah, for everyone but Japan, but it does so across 20 years. So there are benefits coming in RCEP for powdered dry milk, but it will be slow because it's 10% divided across 20 years means a tiny incremental change every year. It's better than nothing, but it's going to take a while. They may move those deadlines forward. I suspect as we get into this agreement and as everybody gets comfortable, you could say, actually, we don't need 20 years, we'll do it in 10. So there may be some benefits coming sooner than later, but it's still challenging. Now, the Chinese concessions are better than many other governments where we have no commitment. So we have a big U, and I would point to Korea in particular as a real challenge, 176% tariff in place for powdered dry milk. And I have the HS code listed here. No commitment. When you see the little U in the schedule, you say, oh, darn it, that means that there's no change for RCEP. So that's unfortunate. Vietnam, you can see, drops from 3 to 5% to 0 on entry into force. So those of you trying to export into Vietnam should get a 3 to 5% benefit immediately. Philippines, 3% to 0 also on entry into force. In other words, on day one, tariff drops already. So there's a mixed bag, I would say, for this particular product. Now, we could do the same kind of analysis for lots of other dairy products. We only did it for the one for this particular presentation, but happy to talk to firms about how we might do this for the bigger part of your inventory. Important as well is the rules of origin down here at the bottom, and I'll get into this in just 1 second. What does the tariff schedule look like? This is Malaysia's tariff schedule, just to show you. So you have at the top here the HS code 0402. This is the category, milk and cream concentrated, da, 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 da. Here is the one we're talking about, powder. Right now, the base rate, in other words, the rate before RCEP comes into force is listed here. Now, the Malaysians have nil, which means 0. But you can see that this particular category is at 5% currently. Then year 1 is when this enters into force, you can see that those tariffs drop to 0. So we're going to have 0 tariffs, and then they continue to 0. In other schedules, you can imagine the Chinese one, for example, that I just mentioned, the base rate is 10%, and it drops incrementally across to year 20. But I just wanted you to see what these tariff schedules look like. They're all available online. I particularly suggest that you use New Zealand or Australia's MFAT and DFAT websites to get an access to the text and all of the schedules. You can see all of the benefits that are coming for you, and you can do this yourself, or you can contact, a specialist provider to help you with this. Now, the rules of origin, I just want to mention briefly, which is also important because you want to make sure that non-members do not sort of sneak in. You don't want, I don't know, Brazilian dairy to sort of sneak in and get the benefits of RCEP. So how do we do that? We have to make sure that we have rules of origin that apply to the trade agreement. They're different from stamping on the box. You can stamp whatever you want on the box, made in wherever. But this is about how do you meet the rules of origin in the FTA itself. Every trade agreement has its own rules, its own ways of meeting rules of origin. And generally, which is sort of interesting for dairy, generally the rule of origin for agriculture is wholly obtained. 100% of the product has to be grown, harvested, dug up, fished, whatever. But basically the cow and everything from the cow has to be local in an FTA partner in order to qualify. Now, what's interesting about RCEP is that they've changed the rules. So RCEP for dairy still has wholly obtained. So if you're 100% from RCEP countries, then you qualify for lower tariffs. But there are also substantial transformation rules, change in tariff classification and regional value content, which I'll talk about in just a second because they're both very relevant for dairy. Here are the dairy rules for powdered milk in this case. And you can see here in the corner, it says CC or RVC 40. So what does that mean? That means if your product was a different chapter, not chapter 4, CC is at the chapter level. It wasn't chapter 4, it converts to become a chapter 4 product, it qualifies. That's less relevant for powdered milk. It can be very relevant for other products like chocolate. So you had milk and cream and chocolate beans and they somehow combined and made a chocolate bar. That could be a change in chapter heading and then it qualifies. So depends on the product. But sometimes change in chapter or change in chapter heading at the 4-digit or 6-digit level is very helpful for firms because it doesn't matter where the raw material comes from, as long as in my RCEP market, I transformed it from what it was to what it is now. I've changed the chapter or the subheading. I then qualify for these benefits. That I think you'll see in RCEP happens a lot. So for agricultural goods, I think this is very useful. The second thing that RCEP has done that can be very helpful for companies is this RVC 40 rule. So it means that 4% of the value of the final product needs to be from the 15 RCEP markets, but 60% of the value could be from outside. So depending on what you produce and how you produce it, you could imagine bringing in imported content with local content, you produce the final product, you can qualify. So for many firms, it will not be as hard to clear the rules of origin as you might imagine, because it's not wholly obtained. I think that's the key. You don't have to create the whole product here for many agricultural lines. So again, I encourage you to read the text and then you can see what are the rules for my specific products. Most of you will not worry so much about services, but I just want to mention that for your services, things like warehousing, logistic, retail, advertising, marketing, you know, consulting services, whatever it happens to be. All of those services are actually going to be easier to move in and around RCEP as well. So it's not just about trade and goods, tariff reductions, but also about services benefits. I'm not going to go into all of the details that are listed on this slide, but I just want to say that for many of you, the services benefits could be substantial as well. And it should reduce your services costs that you have. Crucially, it includes things like no performance requirements, no requirements that you have X number of branches or banks or outlets or whatever. You don't have to have domestic content. So I think there are a lot of new things coming on services that could be very valuable, even for companies that see themselves as goods companies. I also want to mention the same thing about investment. So every one of these economies wanted inbound investment. So what have we done in RCEP? Basically, every sector and subsector for investment is open unless otherwise noted. And in practice, most of these economies are very welcoming now to inbound investment of all kinds. And I think that's very useful for companies because it means that you will have better opportunities for investment for building up operations, whether it's dairy production itself or whether it's retail operations or whatever it happens to be. You should have better opportunities for investment after RCEP comes into force. I think that's very useful. The one caveat I will make is that we do not have investment protection. So typically, and I don't think this matters as much to your sector, but I'll just describe it. Typically, we have a mechanism usually called ISDS, Investor State Dispute Settlement, that says if the government comes and expropriates or seizes your assets and fails to give you fair compensation, you can sue the government. So they allow this. Why? Because we assume that the local court system is going to take a dim view of a foreigner coming in and complaining about government activities. So there's an alternative mechanism, usually in a trade agreement, to ensure that you have another way that you can hold a government accountable. And in RCEP, that is missing for now. So 3 years from now, they will discuss that mechanism. But the point I want to make is that while you can still invest, while we assume that governments are not going to expropriate or seize your assets unfairly, there is a little bit of a risk because we don't have that protection mechanism built into RCEP. What happens to non-members? Basically now, I think we will find more and more companies who are making goods, selling goods in Asia for Asia. Now, we've had a lot of trade in Asia, clearly, but a lot of that trade in Asia is in raw materials and less in finished products. So it might be in, you know, raw dairy products, but not in the finished or processed products because we've had such high tariffs, because the complexity has been so challenging. After you have RCEP start to come into force, I think firms will start to say, how do I manufacture products? How do I market products in Asia for Asia? And RCEP makes that easier for you to do. So I think there will be more and more companies who will set up supply chains, distribution networks, et cetera, in Asia, in RCEP for RCEP. And remember that many of those regional value content rules allow you to still have up to 60% of the value from outside of the 15 markets in the region. So there is still an opportunity for imported content, but you'll have to think hard about what you produce, where you produce it, make sure that you clear it, and then make sure that the benefits are on offer. Because if the section that you care about is unbound and unchanged, then that's less relevant. And then finally, let me just conclude this with a sort of bigger picture. So we've been really down in the weeds. Let me go back out just a little bit for the bigger picture. This is an agreement that's quite interesting. It took a really long time. It took 8 years. There were at least 29 formal rounds. There were 11 rounds where trade ministers met for multiple days to actually sit with a pen and paper and negotiate rules. Even the leaders themselves actually met multiple times across RCEP. It was not an easy deal to get done. At the time that this was going on, we had flare-ups in politics and security challenges. So lots of the members couldn't even sit together outside of RCEP, but they sat in RCEP side by side, got this thing done. That's frankly a miracle. Once it starts, I think we're going to have this platform in place to discuss trade in Asia. And so for many of the companies that look at the initial round of RCEP and you say, well, you know, for example, the dry milk that I just pointed out, is the benefits are modest. I mean, they're useful in some areas, but you would really like, I'm sure, to tackle that Korean tariff of 100 and whatever it is, 76%. That is a monster, it needs to be addressed. How do we do so? Well, potentially over the course of RCEP implementation, and as it gets more comfortable, Korea might, among other things, say, actually that tariff could come down. Could come down. We're feeling a little more comfortable about our interactions. We've seen what's been happening in the region. That's something that could be addressed. Alternatively, and I think this is also important for especially agricultural producers, many of the standards, the testing procedures, the quarantine restrictions, et cetera, could also potentially be tackled in RCEP, so that you could then say, can we have a consistent way in which we test for quality? Can we have a standard that's consistent for this particular product across all 15 markets in Asia? And so there's the potential for RCEP, I think, to be quite useful for companies, but it also requires you to make sure that you stay actively engaged on RCEP, so that you tell governments, your government that you happen to be most close with, this is something that matters to us. Here's why it matters to us. Here's something you should push for when you have RCEP meetings in the future. And so I think as we go forward, this was not the original intention of RCEP. They weren't out to create some kind of, world-changing agreement in Asia. But if you think about where we're at in 2020, COVID, and now 2021 coming out slowly into recovery, the world is a little different than it was when they started negotiations in 2012. And I think for many of these governments, the idea that you could have a platform in Asia to discuss trade and economic issues is really important. So I think it's not just that RCEP matters when it starts in January, but also what it will do over time. And so I'm really delighted to be here with everyone today to discuss why RCEP matters and why it may matter for your sector, even if, as I just showed you, some of you I'm sure are saying, why do I care about RCEP if the benefits are so small? That's just one product. We could have looked at a lot of different dairy products, and certainly, again, you should do so. There will be some more benefits found within this agreement, and it's 15 markets in Asia, in one of the fastest growing parts of the world. So I strongly encourage all of you to pay attention to what's going on in RCEP, because at the end of the day, it will matter for you. And so again, I'm really delighted to have been invited here to talk to you today, and I'm looking forward to the questions and answers from all of you. So thank you so much.